Today I'll be introducing our recent work called ExMap. This was done with at the UiT Machine Learning Group with Adrian Sletten, who was a master's student during the time of this work, who I had the pleasure of co-supervising for this project, and also Michael Kampfmeyer, who is my doctoral advisor. And the outline of this talk will be the following. So first, we will talk about spurious correlations in modern deep learning models, what they are, why we care. Second would be to talk about group robustness, what that research problem aims to solve. The third would be a brief introduction to explainability heat maps, so sort of model explainability techniques. And finally, we present our method, our contribution, and then we provide some concluding remarks. So essentially, all these topics are sort of covered in the title of the talk. And so our attempt will be to essentially explain the title of the paper. So let's begin with spurious correlations. So let's start at the very, very simple setting. So we assume we are given a pre-trained classifier. And let's say this classifier was pre-trained on ImageNet. So let's say an ImageNet pre-trained ResNet 18. So we assume we are given that classifier, and we assume that we are given some training data. Now, what are spurious correlations? So spurious correlations in the training data are all those features which are causally unrelated to the task at hand. So this example dataset provided here is an example from the waterbirds dataset. The task is to classify an image as waterbird or landbird. So it's a binary classification task. And the spurious features in this case would then be all those features in the images which have nothing to do with classifying the bird. So if I were to classify a bird as belonging to a specific type, I would look at the bird's features. I would look at its eyes, its beak, its feathers, and so on. I would not look at the background, for instance. Now it turns out that these are exactly the spurious features which are causally unrelated. So the bird type in any image does not really depend on the background, and neither does the background depend on the bird type. And so any classifier that makes a decision on the bird type should not take into account the background in this case. And that's basically a spurious feature or a spurious correlation. Now, it turns out that classifiers are very good at picking up such correlations during training. And this leads to some unforeseen consequences in the sense that this hurts classifier generalization performance on a debiased or a balanced test set. So one more detail about the waterbirds dataset, we will discuss this later, of course, is that the training set is intentionally biased. So 95% of waterbirds have water backgrounds, and 95% of land birds have land backgrounds. And the dataset exists to show that if you do use a pre-trained ImageNet classifier on top of this, then the classifiers are more susceptible to relying exclusively on the background cues to make their prediction, which is something we don't want. Now, what else can be spurious correlation? So it's not just about a background. It's actually about any spurious feature that can exist in an image that may hamper classifier performance. So this is one of the original papers quite a few years ago now that explored, for example, texture bias in ResNet, in the ResNet architecture, which is pre-trained on ImageNet. So they applied a variety of texture overlays on all objects in the original data set to create certain synthetic data. And what they observed was interesting is that the classifier performance was highly volatile across the styles. Now, ideally, this should not be the case, right? An object, if you want to classify it as such, should still be classified as that object regardless of what style the image is in. But it turns out that modern pre-trained classifiers actually struggle to do this. Now, humans do not. So humans are, so that is not to say that humans are not biased, but whenever humans do some sort of image classification task or object recognition task, humans are much less susceptible to falling for these contextual cues, which are causally unrelated to the task. Now, context is very important for humans, of course, but non-causal context is something that humans are very good at filtering out when they do certain reasoning tasks. And this is the important distinction, is that we need machine predictions to be robust by human standards. And that's why this idea of spurious correlations has been very popular in the deep learning literature in the last decade or so. And it is precisely because of this that we are interested in knowing what are more of such spurious cues that models pick up on, and how can we fix them. So that's a brief introduction to spurious correlations. Next, we will talk about group robustness and what that research domain has to do with spurious correlations. So just a simple two primary preliminaries. The first is assume a data set is divided into groups. So a data set has images and labels for the classes, but we also assume that it has other annotations, which are the groups, and each group is a spurious correlation. I will show you an example of what such a group looks like. But the important part here is that this is known a priori. So we assume we are given two types of labels. The first is your vanilla class labels that tell you what object is in the image. And the second set of labels is the set of group labels. So what sort of spurious correlation is that image part of? So let's look at a certain example. Previously, I talked about this intentionally biased data set called waterbirds. So these are the common bias training examples. The class, as I said, it's a binary classification task. So you have two classes, waterbird and landbird. The authors introduce one particular spurious correlation in the data set, which is the background. So what they do is in the training data, 95% of waterbird images have water-based backgrounds, and 95% of landbird images have land-based backgrounds. And what this does is it exists to demonstrate that the classifiers will pick up on these backgrounds. The test set, however, is balanced. The test set is debiased. So in the sense that 50% of waterbirds will have water backgrounds, and the other set will have land backgrounds. So there it's half and half, but the training data is biased. The groups are specifically those combinations of the class and background. So in one case you have waterbird water background, you would have waterbird land background, you would have land, and land water. So 4 groups in total. Now we assume that both these sets of labels are given to us. For each image, we have the label of the class, but we also have the label of the group. This is an important note to be remembered. I'll come back to this. Now, the objective of the group robustness research paradigm is, okay, given that we are in the group label-based setting, what is the classifier performance, or what is the worst classifier performance on a particular group? We call that metric the worst group accuracy. And this is the metric that researchers in this domain look to optimize. So their idea is that given a data set of groups, we test a classifier on it, we see what the worst group performance is, and then we try to maximize the performance on the worst group without destroying the performance on the other groups simultaneously. So that's the research goal of worst group robustness, and that's the motivation, is that this gives us one paradigm to solve for spurious correlations, because those are explicitly injected into the learning task. But note why this is why this could be a bit dicey, because this setting or the vanilla setting, it assumes that the labels are known a priori. But assuming access to group labels, if you think about it, is unrealistic. Data sets out in the wild are vast and diverse, and it's certainly not manually feasible, especially if you're talking about humans annotating things. It is certainly not feasible to annotate or yeah, to label everything in a realistic way. So it's assuming access to the group labels is unrealistic. It's a time-consuming process, also expensive. So we want unsupervised strategies to do group robustness. Now, the good thing is that we are not the first ones to ask this question. So there have been unsupervised strategies that have been proposed that can estimate the group labels without having access to the annotations. But before we present our method and what our contribution is and what gap we solve in the literature, let's take a brief look at explainability heat maps. So model explainability is, again, a very popular research direction, primarily interested in answering the question, why does a model predict what it predicts? And in the last decade, we have seen so many very well-used algorithms such as GradCam, AppalachianCam, ScoreCam. We've also seen layer-wise, so non-gradient methods like layer-wise relevance propagation, for example. We have seen all these methods, and primarily they are interested in understanding or in attributing model predictions, in the sense that if a model predicted an image of a dog as a dog, where exactly is the model focusing in the image? And that gives us a very nice intuitive understanding of whether the model actually works. We do not want a model that predicts something correctly but has an incorrect reason for predicting something correctly, and vice versa. So we don't want a model to predict something incorrectly and want it to look at something that is not relevant to the object in the image. So this is model explainability. And it turns out that heat maps are useful for model diagnosis. So from the same paper, so this is from the GradCam paper, these images. If you do adversarial perturbation, for example, small corruptions in the original images, and then you test the classifier performance, you will get mispredictions, but now the heat maps give you a useful tool to still check what exactly the model is focusing on in the input image. So that naturally leads us to ask the following question, is that we are interested in spurious correlations. Spurious correlations are those correlations, those features in the data that are causally unrelated to the task that models pick up on. So, and explainability heat maps give us a way to intuitively visualize and realize what features models pick up on. So it seems very straightforward to us that maybe explainability heat maps can be used in the unsupervised group robustness setting. So this is the question we asked. And that leads us to presenting our method called ExMap. In this image, I present a big picture view of the group robustness research setup. So the left part on the left here is a data set with labels and group labels, class labels and group labels. These numbers here are the vanilla classifier accuracies on this data, on these groups. So as we can clearly see, group 3 in this case has the worst group accuracy. Now what happens is, if you have sort of supervised methods, you have access to the ground truth of the groups, and then you can use any training strategy. I will talk about this training strategy in a few minutes. And then you can do group robustness. But we are more interested in the unsupervised group robustness paradigm. And in this area as well, a lot of papers exist. But what we found out was most of these papers are feature based in the sense that if they use some sort of clustering mechanism, for instance, they would do it on the raw classifier features. We are interested in this particular case is, can there be some unsupervised techniques that leverage explainability based attributions instead of the raw classifier feature space? Once we have some estimation like this, once we have some estimation mechanism for groups like this, we can generate pseudo labels. So now we have completely circumvented the need for having access to the ground truth annotations of the groups. So now that we have pseudo labels, we have a training strategy. So here, some popular choices that one can use, what we use at least in the paper is our DFR and JTT. It's not important to know exactly how they work, but on a big picture setting, what I can say is that what they do essentially, that this training strategy, what it will do once it gets these labels is it will do the prediction task, it will compute the misclassifications, and then it will upweight the features of those misclassifications in a novel way to retrain the model. And once the retraining is done, we can have an increased or a much improved, significantly improved performance on the worst group, G3 here. So this is the pipeline of the group robust paradigm, and this is where we operate. This is the explainability-based, unsupervised group robustness to spurious correlations. So hopefully, at least that explains the title. Yeah. Now, what is our method? So let's talk about the method pipeline. So we have input data, which is segmented into groups that we do not assume access to, but we assume that there are groups in the data. We have this frozen ERM model. ERM model is just, you can look at it just as a ResNet pre-trained, ImageNet pre-trained ResNet 18 or ResNet 50. That's a frozen ERM model. We extract the model attributions back to the input space. So in our setting, we use LRP to extract the explainability heat maps, but we show in the paper that it doesn't really matter what explainability technique you use. All that matters is you have some attribution explanation method. So this gives us the heat maps, and what we do is cluster the heat map representations instead. This is where our core novelty lies, is that instead of classifying in the feature space, we clustered the heat maps instead, because intuitively the heat maps give us a sense of what features are relevant and what are not. Now, clustering such representations gives us the pseudo labels automatically. And once we have the pseudo labels, as we saw in the previous setup, we can use any learning strategy such as DFR or JTT to retrain our model. And hopefully this works to improve worst group robustness. This is a view of the algorithm. So first we have we compute the heat map set. So for each batch X, we have the LRP relevance scores. Then we cluster these scores with a clustering method. In the paper, we show that it doesn't really matter what clustering method you use. In our setup, we use this method called SPRAY, which is the spectral clustering of heat maps method. But we show results with k-means as well, and we show that this still works. And then once we have the clustering results, we have the clustering results are the spurious labels, and then we can assign those spurious group labels to the class labels and then retrain just like you would in the original group robust setting. What are some data sets? So we work with both single shortcut and multiple shortcut data sets. What are single shortcut data sets? So a shortcut is a spurious correlation. A single shortcut data set is a data set with a single spurious correlation. So we saw the waterbirds example before where the correlation was the background. So it was one spurious correlation. We also we work on a modification of MNIST, which is the colored MNIST. So every digit less than equal to 4, we assign the color red, and every digit greater than 4, we assign the color green. This is a simple synthetic data set. So in this case, the single spurious correlation would be the color of the digit, which we assume that the model will focus on. We know it will. And finally, we have the cell-away data set where what you want to predict the hair color of an individual, but the spurious correlation is the gender. And this is very important, right? Because we do not want gender bias classifiers to predict anything based on a non-causal spurious attribute such as gender. If you want to predict hair color, you just want to look at the hair. You don't want to look at whether the individual in the picture is a man or a woman, but classifiers do. And this brings me back to my original slide on the need for machine predictions to be robust with respect to human standards. So those are single shortcut data sets. Multiple shortcuts, you have two spurious correlations. So you can have multiple spurious correlations in a data set, which makes it much more challenging. So on the right, we have a much more challenging data set called urban cars, where we have two types of spurious correlations. The label is still binary, so you have a binary classification setup. But in this case, you have two types of spurious features. One is the background, and the other is a co-occurring object that they synthetically paste onto each image. So you could have a country background. So if you're in a village, for example, you could have an urban background if you're in a city. You could have a country co-occurring object such as, farm animals, sheep, horses, cows, etc. And you could have an urban co-occurring object such as, this road sign here, which I'm really sure what this is. Maybe a stop sign. I don't know. So we have two types of data sets. Yes. Now, before we present the results, a little bit on ExMap. So ExMap can be integrated with any group robust learning strategy. So as I said, there are two popular strategies out there called DFR and JTT. Our method is essentially a representation learning method, so it can be attached onto any such learning strategy. ExMap is fully unsupervised, so we do not assume access to group labels. Any heat map extraction method can be integrated with ExMap. So this is very flexible. We do not assume that you only need LRP to do this, for example. We use LRP because, it's great, but you could use GradCam if you wanted. All that we require is you have model attributions back to the input space. That's all. And any clustering method can be integrated with ExMap. So, and we show that in the paper that you can, we use Spray in this work, which uses a spectral clustering based setup, but you can also use k-means and you'll be fine. Okay, so the results on single shortcuts. So these are all the baselines. Yeah, you can see JTT here, DFR here, but there are others. There are many others. This is a very popular research area, and we are able to successfully outperform the baselines on waterbirds and Celebi, the single shortcut data sets. You can see the variant here. So we attach our ExMap learner to the DFR learning strategy. One particular thing I'd like to point out in this table, not everything, two things, let's say. So one is the base model, over which we significantly improve the worst group accuracy, as you can see. But the other important baseline I feel here is George, based on DFR. Now, George is a feature clustering strategy. And we can see that we do better than that as well. These results are all averaged over multiple runs, by the way. And that is the core sort of intuition of or motivation of our work is that we show that you should cluster explainability heat maps instead of the raw classifier features, because the raw classifier features are all entangled in a sense, and they don't tell you about the relevance of the feature with respect to the classifier. So that's on a single shortcut. On the multiple shortcuts as well, we see superior results to both the base model and George. This comparison we made with respect to George and base because already in table 1 in the paper we saw that really the two good models were essentially George and ExMap, our method, and we can outperform the baselines here as well on both varieties of urban cars and CMNIST. Okay, but So those are the results, but we need a bit more intuition on why ExMap works. So we do an extended analysis section, trying to sort of shed more insight into why this strategy actually works. So first question we ask in our analysis is, why are the heat maps useful over the raw features? So to do this, we construct a simple data set. This is not an original data set, by the way. Others construct this data set as well to test out their hypothesis. And this is called Waterbird's foreground. So what we do is we just remove the background in the image. And note that the spurious correlation in Waterbirds is the background. So then ideally, if you remove the background, you'd want your learning strategy, or you'd want your representations to help the learning strategy focus better on the actual object features, because the background is gone. And we see that. We see exactly that. So here in the table, if we compare the baselines with respect to the original accuracy, the original mean accuracy, and now we compute the accuracy on the new data set, we compute the drop in accuracy, because your performance will drop because all classifiers are biased. But we see that in our case, the drop is the least significant among all baselines. Now this shows that ExMap circumvents background reliance, which is very important. And this ties to what I said before, is that the heat maps essentially give you what relevant features are in the data set, with what the model considers to be relevant features. And raw clusters, raw features do not. Second analysis is what we looked at, is how does ExMap improve explanations itself? So let's say you used ExMap and then you do some LRP or GradCam to visualize your new results. How do you do? And we compare it to a base ResNet pre-trained model, and we see clearly sharper explanations provided instead of all these spurious attributions that the frozen base model does. Next, we ask, how does ExMap improve model strategy? So we were interested in the question of if, for example, you're in a hair classification setup in Celeb, we do not want the models to focus on the gender instead of, while classifying the hair color, because the gender has nothing to do with it. But it turns out in Celeb, since most blonde pictures are of women, classifiers are susceptible to picking up on that spurious correlation. And here I would like to attract your attention to this group here. This is exactly what we wanted. In this case, we can see in group 4, by the way, red is every feature that the classifier considers important, and blue are all those features that the classifier considers irrelevant. And this is what we wanted, is that while classifying, you pick up the actual hair features instead of the face features here. And we see that elsewhere as well. Of course, you can't, I mean, it is impossible to remove it completely. So you can see, for example, here that the classifier still focuses on the eyes, but it does focus on the object of interest much more, which is the class you want to predict, and not the spurious feature, such as the gender of the individual in the image. So this is another way of showing why ExMap improves the model strategy. ExMap's robustness is a clustering method. I mentioned before that it doesn't really matter what clustering method you use. We use spray and then we use k-means as well, but we observe significantly improved results over the base models. ExMap's robustness to the learning strategy. I also said while presenting the pipeline that there are two popular methods. There are many more actually, as I showed in the baselines, but two of the most popular methods as backbones are DFR and JTT. And we use JTT as well as a backbone to attach ExMap on top of, and we see that it doesn't really matter what learning strategy you use. The representation learning method is robust to these design choices. Okay, so we are ready to conclude. We started by asking the question, classifiers, why do they fail? And they fail because they pick up spurious cues in the data. That's it. It's really as as straightforward as that. That data sets in the real world are biased. They have multiple types of spurious correlations that it's infeasible for humans to manually annotate through. And classifiers pick up on these spurious correlations because they do not have human reasoning. And that's really the lowdown. There really isn't any other black magic going on here. And the idea is to really pick up such spurious correlations in the sense that we need to understand what spurious correlations the classifiers have learned, because the machine predictions need to be robust according to human standards. We showed some examples of spurious cues in the data. We used synthetic sets, but also real-world data such as CELEB. And we showed single types of spurious cues and multiple types of spurious cues. And then we said that if you want an unsupervised strategy where you say that, okay, we cannot assume access to the underlying group labels, which is a very realistic assumption, because in the real world, nobody will parse through a data set to give you the group labels. Then you can use a clustering-based strategy, but cluster heat maps instead of raw classifier features, and you can do much better. And we also showed the flexibility of our method in the sense that it doesn't really matter what heat map attribution method you use or what clustering method you use here in this block. You'll be fine. This work was accepted at CVPR 2024, which will be held in Seattle in this year. This is the QR code if you want to scan it. I will be in Seattle in June to present this. So please, if you are working on related stuff, please come say hi to us. I think my advisor, I think Michael will also be there. I do not know the poster number yet, but I mean, I'm sure you can find us if you just walk around a little bit. So that's the paper, and I'd be happy to answer any questions and have a larger discussion surrounding this. Yes, thank you.